He paid me $30 million to divorce. Then a fertility report exposed his pregnant mistress. The pen felt heavier than any object I had ever held in my life as I hovered it above the line that would end 14 years of my marriage, and the last thing I expected, as my husband slid a check for $30 million across the mahogany table without even looking me in the eye, was that within 3 weeks a single piece of paper from a fertility clinic would unravel every lie he had built his new life upon, and reveal that the woman carrying his unborn child was carrying a secret far more devastating than either of us could have imagined. Before I tell you how it all unraveled, I want to say something to you, the people watching this right now, because stories like mine are never just about money or betrayal, they are about the quiet strength it takes to keep believing in kindness even when the person who promised to love you forever hands you a check instead of an apology. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that forgiveness can exist even after the deepest wounds, and if you believe that hope has a way of finding us again when we least expect it, I want you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little light today, and subscribe to our channel, because our community was built on stories exactly like this one. Stories that remind us we are never as alone as we feel. My name is Clara Ashbourne, and for most of my adult life I believed that love meant sacrifice, that if you gave enough of yourself to another person, eventually they would give you back a life worth living. I met Julian Hartwell when I was 26 years old, working as a junior architect at a small firm in Chicago that specialized in restoring old brownstones, breathing new life into buildings that everyone else had given up on. There was something poetic about that work, taking something broken and forgotten and finding the parts of it still worth saving, and I like to think that instinct is what drew me to Julian in the first place, because when I met him he was still a mid-level executive at his father's logistics company, ambitious but not yet hardened, hungry but not yet cruel. He used to bring me coffee at my drafting table before the sun came up, and he would sit quietly and watch me sketch for an hour before either of us said a word, and in that silence I felt more understood than I had ever felt with anyone who talked constantly just to fill space. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony in his mother's garden, surrounded by string lights and the smell of jasmine, and I remember thinking, as he slid the ring onto my finger, that I had found the one person in the world who would never make me feel like I had to earn my place beside him. For the first several years, our marriage was, by any measure, a happy one. Julian's company grew from a regional logistics firm into a national shipping empire, and with that growth came money, more money than either of us had grown up with, more money than I ever imagined touching in my lifetime. We bought a house in the suburbs with a wraparound porch that I filled with hanging ferns, and on weekends Julian would grill on the back deck while I sketched renovation plans for neighbors who admired our home, and it felt, for a long time, like we were building something that would outlast us both. The one shadow that hung over those early years, the one thing neither of us spoke about directly but both of us carried like a stone in our pockets, was the absence of a child. We had assumed, the way young couples often do, that a baby would come when we were ready, that our bodies would simply cooperate with our plans the way everything else in our lives seemed to, but 2 years of trying turned into 4, and 4 turned into 6, and eventually the silence around the subject became its own kind of grief, one we never learned how to share with each other. I was the one who first suggested we see a specialist, because I could not shake the feeling that something inside me had failed, that my body was somehow the reason our house never filled with the sound of small feet on the hardwood floors I had refinished myself. Julian agreed to go with me, though I remember he seemed distracted during the appointment, checking his phone in the waiting room, and when Dr. Rosalind Ferris called us into her office to discuss the results, I remember gripping the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles went white, bracing myself for whatever verdict she was about to deliver. She explained, gently, that my hormone levels were within a normal range, that my reproductive health showed no significant abnormalities, but that further testing would be needed on both of us to understand the full picture, since fertility, she reminded us, is rarely a story about only one person. Julian, I remember, grew quiet after that appointment, quieter than I had ever seen him, and when I suggested he schedule the follow-up testing Dr. Ferris had recommended, he waved it off, telling me he was too busy with a merger at work, that we could revisit it later, that there was no rush. I did not push him, because I loved him, and because some small, frightened part of me was relieved that the conversation had moved away from the possibility that the fault might not be entirely mine to carry. Looking back now, I understand that this was the moment our marriage began its slow, invisible unraveling, though neither of us could have named it then. I carried the unspoken weight of our childlessness like a wound I was ashamed to show anyone, and Julian, rather than carrying that weight beside me, began quietly stepping away from it, filling the space with work trips and late nights and a growing distance that I mistook, for years, as the ordinary strain of a demanding career rather than the slow construction of an exit. By the time we reached our 12th year of marriage, Julian's company had gone public, and the man I married had transformed into someone I sometimes struggled to recognize, a man who spoke to me in the clipped, efficient tones he used with his board members, a man who seemed to measure everything, including our marriage, by whether it still served a purpose. I told myself this was simply what success did to people, that underneath the armor he was still the man who used to sit quietly and watch me sketch, and I clung to that belief the way you cling to a photograph of someone who has already left the room. The signs, when I allow myself to look back honestly, had been there for over a year before the day he asked me to sit down at that mahogany table. There were phone calls he took in other rooms, business trips that stretched longer than they used to, a new attentiveness to his appearance that I chose to interpret as vanity rather than evidence. There was a woman named Vanessa Klein, whom he introduced to me at a company gala 18 months before the divorce, describing her as a rising strategist in the marketing division, a woman nearly 15 years younger than either of us, with a sharp, confident laugh and eyes that lingered on Julian a half-second too long even as she shook my hand. I remember feeling a flicker of unease that evening, the kind of instinct that lives in your stomach long before your mind is willing to name it, but I told myself I was being paranoid, that a happily married woman does not go looking for reasons to distrust her husband, and so I buried the feeling the way I had buried so many other feelings over the years, beneath politeness and denial and the desperate hope that if I simply loved him well enough, everything else would sort itself out. The morning Julian asked me to meet him at the offices of his attorney, Nathaniel Cross, rather than at home, should have told me everything I needed to know, but I still walked into that glass conference room believing, in some quiet corner of my heart, that we were there to discuss a business matter, perhaps something involving the house or our joint investments, because even after everything, I could not fully accept that the man I had spent half my life loving was capable of what came next. Julian did not stand when I entered. He did not offer me coffee the way he used to, all those years ago, before the sun rose over my drafting table. He simply gestured to the chair across from him, and once I sat, he slid a folder toward me containing divorce papers already drawn up, along with a check made out to me for $30 million, and he said, in a voice so calm it frightened me more than shouting ever could have, that he wanted this to be simple, that he wanted no lawyers dragging things through the courts, no messy fight over assets, that he was prepared to make sure I would never want for anything financially if I would. Simply sign and let us both move forward with our lives. I sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the number on that check, a number so large it barely registered as real, and I remember asking him, my voice shaking in a way I hated, whether there was someone else, and I remember the way his jaw tightened, the way he glanced briefly at Nathaniel before looking back at me and saying only that our marriage had run its course, that we both deserved the chance to build lives that made us happy, and that dwelling on reasons would not change the outcome. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. He simply sat there, a stranger wearing the face of the man I had married, waiting for me to sign, and in that moment, something inside me that had been holding on for years finally let go. I picked up the pen. I signed my name on every line Nathaniel had flagged with small yellow tabs, and I walked out of that office with a check for $30 million and a hollowness in my chest that no amount of money could have touched. My best friend, Teresa Bloom, was the one who picked me up outside that building, because I could not bring myself to drive, my hands trembling too badly to trust myself behind the wheel. Teresa and I had known each other since architecture school, and she was the kind of friend who did not need to be told what had happened to understand the shape of my grief. She simply pulled me into the passenger seat, handed me a bottle of water, and drove us to her apartment without asking a single question until I was ready to speak. When I finally told her everything, the check, the papers, the silence where an explanation should have been, she did not gasp or rage the way I might have expected. She simply held my hand and said that money could rebuild a life but it could never repair a heart, and that the work ahead of me was not about the $30 million sitting untouched in a new account. It was about remembering who I was before I spent 14 years shrinking myself to fit into someone else's story. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life, harder even than the years of quiet grief over the child we never had, because at least during those years I still believed I was loved, even imperfectly, even distantly. Now I had to learn how to exist in a world where the person who knew me best had decided I was no longer worth the truth. I moved into a small rented townhouse across the city, refusing, out of some stubborn pride, to touch the settlement money for anything beyond the essentials, as though spending it would mean accepting that it was a fair trade for everything I had lost. Teresa checked on me every day, sometimes bringing soup, sometimes simply sitting with me while I stared at the wall, and slowly, in the way grief moves when you let it move honestly instead of running from it, I began to feel pieces of myself returning. I picked up a sketchbook again for the first time in years, not for any client, just for myself, drawing the outlines of a small house with a garden, a house that belonged to no one but me. It was nearly a month after the divorce was finalized that the phone call came from Nathaniel Cross's office, the same attorney who had drafted the papers I signed, informing me that there were outdated medical authorization forms on file from years earlier, tied to a joint account I had once shared with Julian for our fertility treatments, and that as part of closing out the last of our shared financial and legal records, the firm needed my signature to release those old files to be properly archived or destroyed, whichever I preferred. I almost told them to shred everything without looking at it, because I did not think I had the strength to revisit that chapter of my life, the years of appointments and disappointment and quiet shame, but something, some instinct I still cannot fully explain, made me ask instead for copies of the full file before any decision was made. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my townhouse, and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea slowly going cold beside me as I opened it, expecting nothing more than old paperwork to glance through and discard. What I found instead was a report I had never seen before, dated nearly 9 years earlier, from a specialist named Dr. Rosalind Ferris had referred Julian to for the follow-up testing he claimed to have never gotten around to. The report was addressed to Julian directly, sent to a private email account rather than our shared household one, and it stated, in the flat, clinical language of medical documentation, that Julian's semen analysis had revealed severe oligospermia bordering on azoospermia, a condition that made natural conception with his own sperm highly improbable without significant medical intervention. My hands went cold as I read it a second time, then a third, because I understood, with a clarity that felt like the floor dropping out from beneath me, that for 9 years, Julian had known, with medical certainty, that the difficulty conceiving a child was very likely his own, and he had let me carry that grief alone, had let me absorb it as my private failure, had let it become the quiet wound that shaped how I saw my own body and my own worth for nearly a decade of my life, all while knowing the truth and choosing silence. I sat at that table for hours, the tea long since forgotten, turning the pages over and over as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. I thought of every appointment I had gone to alone when his schedule was too full, every night I had cried quietly in the bathroom so he would not hear, every time he had gently suggested, in that careful, sympathetic tone he was so good at, that perhaps we should simply accept that some couples were not meant to have children, as though the failure belonged only to the body lying beside his in the dark. I thought of the years I had spent feeling broken, feeling as though I had failed at the most basic function a woman was supposedly meant to fulfill, and I felt something inside me shift from grief into something sharper, something closer to fury, though even in that fury I did not yet understand how much further the truth would still unfold. It was Teresa who first said the words that turned my anger into something colder and more urgent, sitting across from me at my kitchen table as I showed her the report with hands that would not stop shaking. She read it twice, her expression darkening with each line, and then she looked up at me and asked, quietly, whether I had heard anything about Vanessa Klein being pregnant, because she had seen a photograph circulating among mutual acquaintances from Julian's company of Vanessa at a recent baby shower thrown by her co-workers, visibly pregnant, glowing in the way people glow when they believe the hardest part of their story is already behind them. I felt my stomach drop as the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape I did not want to see, because if this report was accurate, if Julian's fertility had been severely compromised nearly a decade ago with no indication in his own records of any treatment or intervention since, then the child Vanessa was carrying, the child Julian had left me for, the child that had likely been the final, unspoken reason he wanted a quiet, uncontested divorce, was almost certainly not his biological child at all. I want to pause here and speak honestly to you, because I know some of you watching may have lived through betrayal of your own, may know the particular ache of discovering that the story you believed about your life was never the whole truth, and I want you to understand that in this moment, sitting at my kitchen table with Teresa's hand resting over mine, I did not feel triumphant, I did not feel vindicated the way you might expect. I felt an overwhelming, complicated sorrow, because even after everything, some small part of me still ached for the man I had married, still grieved the version of him I had loved before ambition and secrecy hollowed him out, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that whatever came next was not going to feel like winning, it was simply going to be the truth, finally standing where lies had stood for far too long. I did not act rashly. I did not call Julian in a rage, though every instinct in me wanted to. Instead, I brought the report to Nathaniel Cross, the same attorney who had represented Julian during our divorce, and I watched his composed, professional face falter as he read through the documentation, because even he, I realized, had likely never seen this file, had likely drafted our settlement without any knowledge that his own client had been hiding a medical truth capable of unraveling everything. Nathaniel explained, carefully, that while the divorce settlement itself was legally binding and unlikely to be reopened simply on the grounds of this discovery, since I had signed willingly and the settlement had been generous, there were other implications worth considering, particularly if Julian intended to claim legal paternity of a child that medical evidence strongly suggested could not biologically be his. He advised me, gently, that what I chose to do with this information was entirely my decision, that I owed Julian nothing further, not silence, not confrontation, not forgiveness, and that whatever path I chose should serve my own healing first and everything else second. For several days, I sat with that advice, turning it over the way I used to turn over difficult design problems at my drafting table, searching for the solution that would honor both the truth and my own peace. Teresa encouraged me to simply walk away, to take my $30 million and my sketchbook and build the quiet, honest life I deserved, letting Julian's choices catch up to him without my involvement. There was a strong pull toward that path, a desire to protect the fragile healing I had only just begun to feel. But there was another part of me, the part that had spent 9 years quietly believing her own body had failed her, that needed Julian to know the truth was no longer his to control, not out of revenge, but because I could not fully release the weight of those years without setting the facts down where they belonged. I called Julian myself, on a Thursday morning in early spring, and asked him to meet me, not at his attorney's office this time, but at the small coffee shop near the Brownstone district where we used to walk together in the earliest days of our marriage, back when love still felt like an uncomplicated thing. He seemed surprised by the request, his voice guarded but curious, and he agreed to meet me that same afternoon. I remember sitting in that coffee shop, sunlight pouring through the front windows, watching him walk in looking thinner than I remembered, his usual composure slightly frayed at the edges, and I felt none of the fury I had expected to feel, only a strange, steady calm, the calm of someone who has finally stopped waiting for someone else to hand her the truth and has decided to hand it to herself instead. I did not raise my voice when I placed the folder on the table between us. I simply told him that Nathaniel's office had sent over old records as part of closing our financial files, and that among them was a report he had apparently never mentioned to me, from Dr. Ferris's referral nearly 9 years earlier. I watched the color drain from his face as he opened the folder and recognized the document, watched his hand still over the pages the way mine had stilled over them days before, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring down at proof of a truth he had buried so deeply he had perhaps convinced even himself it did not matter anymore. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than I had ever heard it, and he admitted, haltingly, that he remembered the appointment, remembered the diagnosis, and that he had been so afraid, so ashamed, of what it might mean about his own worth as a man, as a husband, that he had told himself it was easier to let the silence sit between us than to say the words out loud. He said he told himself for years that it did not matter which of us carried the difficulty, that avoiding the conversation was simply avoiding pain, but as the years passed and the silence calcified into something neither of us knew how to break, it became easier to let me believe the fault was mine than to face what the truth might do to the image he had built of himself. I asked him, then, the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I read that report, whether he had ever undergone treatment, whether there was any medical possibility that Vanessa's child could be his, and I watched something break open in his face, something that looked less like anger and more like a man finally confronting a version of himself he had spent years avoiding in every mirror. He admitted that he had not pursued treatment, that his condition, according to the specialists he consulted quietly after our divorce when Vanessa first told him she was pregnant, had not improved, that in fact a fertility clinic had confirmed to him only weeks earlier, in preparation for what he had assumed would be a joyful confirmation of paternity, that natural conception on his part remained highly unlikely. He had not yet told Vanessa. He had not yet allowed himself to ask the question the report in front of him had already answered. I want to tell you, because I think it matters, that in that moment I felt no satisfaction watching him unravel. I felt only a quiet, aching sadness for all of us, for the years I had spent grieving a wound that was never mine to carry alone, for the man across from me who had let shame convince him that hiding the truth was safer than facing it together, and for a young woman I barely knew who was carrying a child inside a story built on assumptions that were about to collapse. I told Julian, gently but firmly, that what he chose to do next was no longer any concern of mine, that I had not come to punish him but simply to make sure the truth no longer lived only inside a folder I alone had read, and then I stood, thanked him for finally being honest, and walked out of that coffee shop into the spring sunlight, feeling lighter than I had felt in longer than I could remember. What happened next, I only learned in pieces over the following weeks, some from Teresa, who still had connections at Julian's company, and eventually, surprisingly, from Julian himself, who reached out to me nearly 2 months later, not to ask anything of me, but simply, he said, because I deserved to hear the ending of a story I had unknowingly helped bring to light. He told me that he had confronted Vanessa with the fertility clinic's findings, and that after an agonizing conversation, she had finally admitted that the child she was carrying belonged to a colleague she had been seeing intermittently throughout the final year of my marriage to Julian, a relationship she claimed had been over by the time she and Julian became involved, though the timeline, when Julian finally forced himself to examine it honestly, told a very different story. Vanessa left the company shortly after, and Julian, for all his wealth and all his careful control over every aspect of his life, was left standing in the wreckage of 2 relationships built on lies he had told himself were manageable, small, containable, until they were not. I share this not to dwell in the details of Julian and Vanessa's unraveling, because their story is theirs to carry now, but because of what happened inside me during those same months, which is really the heart of what I want you to take from this. While Julian was confronting the collapse of the life he thought he was building, I was, for the first time in years, building something entirely my own. I finally allowed myself to touch the settlement money, not out of spite or vindication, but out of a growing sense that I owed it to myself to create something meaningful from the wreckage of everything I had lost. I reached out to Dr. Rosalind Ferris, the same specialist who had once sat across from Julian and me in her small office, and I told her I wanted to fund something in her clinic, a program specifically for women who had spent years believing infertility struggles were their fault alone, women who, like me, had absorbed silent shame that was never fully theirs to carry, women who needed not just medical support but the kind of emotional acknowledgement that no report or diagnosis alone could offer them. Dr. Ferris cried when I told her, right there in her office, and she told me that in 20 years of practice, she had never once had a patient return not for treatment but to build a bridge for others still standing where I had once stood. Together, over the following months, we established a fund within her clinic dedicated to counseling and financial support for women navigating fertility struggles alongside strained marriages, a place where couples could be gently guided toward honest conversations rather than years of silent blame, where women would never again have to wonder alone, the way I had wondered for 9 years, whether their own bodies were the reason love was slipping away from them. I named it, after much thought, the Ashbourne Circle, using the maiden name I reclaimed the day my divorce was finalized, a small, quiet act of taking my own story back into my own hands. Teresa likes to tease me that I turned $30 million of heartbreak into the most beautiful renovation project of my life, and in a way, she is right, because I approached the work of rebuilding myself the same way I once approached restoring an old brownstone, not by tearing everything down and starting from nothing, but by carefully, patiently identifying which parts of my old life were still structurally sound enough to build upon, and which parts needed to be let go entirely so something healthier could take their place. I kept my love of sketching, my friendship with Teresa, my belief in the quiet dignity of honest work. I let go of the belief that my worth was measured by whether I could give someone else a child, or a company, or a version of myself small enough to never threaten their comfort. Nearly a year after that spring afternoon in the coffee shop, I received a letter from Julian, handwritten, which surprised me, because I could not remember him ever writing me anything by hand in all our years together. In it, he told me that he had spent the months since our conversation in therapy, something he admitted he had scoffed at for most of his life, believing it was a weakness reserved for people who had not yet learned to control their circumstances the way he prided himself on controlling his. He wrote that facing what he had done, not just to Vanessa's situation but to me, across 9 years of silence, had forced him to understand that control and honesty are not the same thing, that he had spent so long trying to manage the narrative of his own life that he had forgotten how to simply live inside the truth of it. He did not ask me to forgive him in that letter. He said only that he hoped, someday, if I found it in myself, I might, not for his sake, but because he had come to believe, watching the wreckage of his choices, that carrying resentment forever was its own kind of prison, and he did not want that prison for me even though he understood he had built its walls himself. I sat with that letter for a long time before I responded, because forgiveness, I have learned, is not something you can rush toward simply because someone finally apologizes correctly. I thought about the 9 years of silent shame, the check slid across a table without an explanation, the slow, careful way he had let me believe I was the reason our life together had gone quiet. But I also thought about the man who used to bring me coffee before sunrise and watch me sketch without saying a word, and I understood that people can hold both truths inside them, the capacity for real love and the capacity for real cowardice, and that forgiving someone does not mean pretending the cowardice never happened, it simply means deciding not to let it define the rest of your own story. I wrote back to Julian, eventually, a short letter, far shorter than his, telling him that I forgave him, not because what he did was small, but because I had decided I no longer wanted anger to be the architecture holding up my days. I told him about the Ashbourne Circle, about Dr. Ferris, about the women we were already beginning to help, women who came into that clinic carrying the same silent shame I once carried, and who left, slowly, session by session, beginning to understand that their bodies were not verdicts, that their worth was not a diagnosis. I told him I hoped he found peace, genuinely, because a world with more peace in it, even inside the heart of a man who had hurt me, felt like a better world than one built entirely on my own bitterness. If there is one thing I hope you carry with you from my story, it is this, and I want you to take a moment, before you keep scrolling, to sit with it, because I believe it matters more than almost anything else I could tell you. The most painful betrayals in our lives rarely come from the moment someone finally tells us a hard truth, they come from all the years before that moment, all the silence we mistake for peace, all the shame we quietly agree to carry alone because we believe love means never asking the other person to carry their share. If you are sitting somewhere right now, carrying a weight you have convinced yourself is entirely your own to bear, whether it is grief, or guilt, or a wound someone else helped create but let you hold alone, I want you to know that the truth, even when it arrives late, even when it arrives in the form of an old report tucked inside a forgotten folder, has the power to set you free, if you are brave enough to let it. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you something, because I believe the comments section beneath a story like this one is its own kind of Ashbourne Circle, a place where strangers become a little less alone simply by telling each other the truth. I would love for you to leave a comment sharing what forgiveness has meant in your own life, or what lesson from this story touched you most deeply, because I read every single one, and I believe there is something powerful in knowing that somewhere out there, someone else understands exactly what you have carried. 2 years have passed now since the day I signed those divorce papers with trembling hands, believing I was signing away the last chapter of my worth along with my marriage. I live in a smaller home now, one I designed myself, with a garden full of the same jasmine that once bloomed in Julian's mother's yard the day we married, because I have learned that you can keep the parts of your past that still bring you peace without keeping the parts that brought you pain. Teresa lives 2 streets over, and we have dinner together most Sundays, the same as we did in architecture school, laughing over the same jokes we have been telling each other for over 20 years. The Ashbourne circle has grown beyond anything I imagined that first afternoon in Dr. Ferris's office, now supporting women in 3 clinics across the state, each one filled with people who remind me, every single day, that the money Julian handed me across that mahogany table, the money I once saw only as evidence of everything I had lost, became instead the foundation of everything I was finally able to build. I do not know what became of Vanessa, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not carry any anger toward her either, because I understand now that she was likely carrying her own quiet griefs, her own complicated choices, and that the story of what happened between her and Julian was never truly mine to resolve. Julian and I are not close, we do not speak often, but when we do, on the rare occasion something requires it, there is a gentleness between us now that never existed in the final years of our marriage, a strange, hard-won honesty that only seems to arrive after everything false has finally burned away. I like to think that somewhere in this world, that younger version of him, the one who used to sit quietly and watch me sketch before sunrise, is still in there somewhere, still capable of the kind of honesty he was too afraid to offer me when it mattered most, and I hope, genuinely, that he finds his way back to that version of himself, even if I am no longer the one standing beside him when he does. As for me, I wake up most mornings now in a house filled with light, and I sit at a drafting table that faces my garden, and I sketch not because anyone is paying me to, but because I finally remember how much I love the simple, patient work of taking something broken and finding the parts of it still worth saving. I think, sometimes, about the woman who sat in that glass conference room all those years ago, staring at a check for $30 million, believing her worth had just been reduced to a single number, and I wish I could reach back through time and tell her that the real inheritance waiting for her was not the money at all, it was the truth, and the strength she did not yet know she had, and the second chance that was already quietly making its way toward her, even in the middle of her darkest morning. If this story touched your heart even a little, I hope you will like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another one of these journeys, because our family here is built on exactly the kind of belief that carried me through the hardest year of my life, the belief that no matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how long the silence, truth and kindness and second chances always find their way back to the people brave enough to keep believing in them, and I hope, wherever you are watching this from, that you hold on to that belief a little tighter tonight than you did this morning, because your own second chance may already be closer than you think.